Well, hello, vinyl community. Elliot here, Lazy Dogs Records, and I hope everyone's doing well on this Super Bowl Sunday. I thought I would do a little video about one of the indie labels that I'm very fond of, called Sugar Hill Records, a roots record label that existed from, well, in its original form from 1978 to 1998, and it went on to be bought up by a larger corporation and merged in with some other record labels a couple of times after that. So it's still in existence today, but not in its original form as a small independent record label. Now, the story of Sugar Hill Records begins with a young man named Barry Poss. And Barry Poss, a Canadian, came down to Durham, North Carolina to pursue his doctoral degree. He was a James Buchanan Duke Fellow in the sociology department at Duke University, where he was again studying for his doctorate in sociology. He was uh, well on his way to completing that. He came down in the late 1960s, and in 1975 he answered an ad from a small record label in Virginia looking for a graphic designer. He had no skill in graphic design, no background in graphic design, but he applied for the job, interviewed, and ended up getting the job. And one chapter short of completing his dissertation, he dropped out of school at Duke and thus began a career in music that would last him a lifetime. Barry Poss went to work at County and learned everything uh, from A to Z about running an independent record label. He was a big fan of roots music, and he so this was perfect label for him. County is a great label, still in existence today, by the way. A lot of reissues of old 78s onto LP form, artists releases, contemporary artist releases in the bluegrass realm, in the mountain music realm, that sort of thing. And it was a great learning ground for him. And in 1978, 3 years after he started there, he came back to Durham to form his own record label with the blessings of what's his name, David Freeman, I believe it was, that owned County Records. In fact, I think Freeman and he were kind of had formed some sort of a little partnership for Sugar Hill for the first couple of years before in 1980, Poss took full ownership of Sugar Hill Records. So he's moved back down from Virginia. He's in Durham, and he has created a record label based on his interests. And he wanted a roots oriented record label that also could be contemporary. So it was the tension between traditional and contemporary that was what made Sugar Hill vibrant as a record label. Now, the first release that they made was what we're listening to now in the background, Boone Creek. Boone Creek, one-way track is this album, the original Sugar Hill release, and a great lineup. Boone Creek did not last a long time as a band, but they were a wonderful band. Terry Balcom, who went on to play in many important bluegrass bands, West Golden, uh, Steve Bryant on the bass, Ricky Skaggs on fiddle and mandolin, and he and Golden handled, and Jerry Douglas on the dobro. And this is a perfect example of that blending of contemporary with with tradition. And as Skaggs said years later, he said, we were contemporary, but boy, we love that traditional stuff so much, we never ventured that far from it. Now, so this is the first release. Uh, Poss later said he was guided by two major principles. Okay. Be what you are, stand for something basically, Don't try to be all things to all people. Be what you want to be, what you decide you're going to be as a record label, and select a roster of prestigious artists that can fulfill that vision. Now, obviously, this is a niche market for records. Uh, Paul later said, we one of the keys was we never tried to be like a mainstream record label, be like a major label. They came to us. We didn't go to them as far as a meeting of blending of the music. I think that's important. So that tension between the old and new was always present. Now, Boone Creek, 1978, was the first release. A couple of years later, Ricky Skaggs released this very important album, great album, Sweet Temptation. And that's taken a photograph. You'll see that background a lot in Sugar Hill Records from downtown Durham. Uh, and this was just a great album that was contemporary while tapping into all the important uh, genres of of roots country tinged roots music. There is the harmony vocals. There is also the post-war honky tonk. It's not an extremely bluegrass album. There are flavors of bluegrass in that as well, but it's at its heart contemporary, and it definitely caught the attention of the public because this is a small independent label. Remember, this is 1979 when it came out, a year after Boone Creek, and it sold 150,000 records. Now, for an upstart record label, an independent record label, that was huge. And it caught the attention of Epic Records. So, Epic and Sugar Hill did a collaborative effort on Ricky Skaggs' next album, Don't Cheat in Our Hometown. And that record propelled Skaggs' career as a contemporary artist. It also ushered in the beginnings of the neo-traditional movement in country, popular country music. It had been going through a very much a pop phase, that pop phase was still very prevalent in country music at that time. But then we get artists like Ricky Skaggs and Randy Travis and Dwight Yoakam and artists like that who who offer a more rootsy sound than the pop influence that was so prevalent during much of that time. Sugar Hill went on to release hundreds and hundreds of albums. I counted up. I've got counting duplicates, and I've got duplicates of a couple of these. I've got 52 Sugar Hill Records albums, and they're wonderful records. They stay true to the mission. I'll just show you a few. Oftentimes, uh, acoustic guitar, of course, will be a prominent instrument. And a good example would be Dan Crary. He did several records for Sugar Hill. I'll show you the label that you'll see. You'll identify Sugar Hill. And Dan Crary is one of the top acoustic guitarists out there. A number of artists came through Sugar Hill at one point or another in their careers. A band that had been blending the contemporary with the traditional for many years before this would be the Country Gentlemen. They've been around, I guess, since the late 50s or at least early 60s, and then did records for labels from Smithsonian Folkways to Rebel to County to some major label releases. The Country Gentleman, and this is Sit Down Young Stranger from 1980, and of course Charlie Waller is the all long time leader of that band, been around a long time. Offshoot of that band would be the Seldom Seen, who did a few later records on Sugar Hill, but it also Sugar Hill also offered an opportunity for artists in traditional bluegrass bands or more traditional to branch out a little bit. And one example of that, two great albums from Mr. John Starling, and this is Waiting on a Southern Train. John Starling, who was lead vocalist for many years for the Seldom Seen, and banjo players like Carl Jackson. And this is Song of the South. Hot bluegrass bands from the 70s like Hot Rise. Most of their work is on Flying Fish, but this is one on Sugar Hill. Issue would be the Hillman, uh, also known as the Golden State Boys, which featured the Gosden brothers, Chris Hillman, and and Don Parmley, who would go on to form the Bluegrass Cardinals, bluegrass band who did several recordings with uh, Sugar Hill. And so this is a reissue. Sugar Hill, after re-releasing the Hillman album, uh, Barry Poss and Hillman began to talk a little bit. And here I'll try to give you a little idea of what this label was like. And I'm reading from uh, Time Between, Chris Hillman's book, Time Between. And I'll skip around here a little bit just to include the pertinent part about Sugar Hill. He said, Sugar Hill was what you would call a boutique label by today's standards. It was primarily geared toward folk and bluegrass, which was perfect for me. I had already decided to rediscover what really got me interested in music, and that it was time for me to play acoustic guitar and mandolin again. He talks about touring with Al Perkins and having some success. And he says, when it was time to make the record, I brought in all my old pals again. In addition to Al, the festivities were joined by Herb Peterson, Kenny Wirtz, Byron Berline, Emery Gordy, and Bernie Leadon. And we called the album Morning Sky after a Dan Fogelberg song and recorded some great tunes by John Prine, Bob Dylan, and Chris Christopherson, as well as J.D. Souders' great song Mexico. Morning Sky, name of the album, did well enough around the States, Canada, and Europe to bring in some incredible festival and theater bookings. I was pleased, and Sugar Hill was pleased. The beautiful part of my experience with that label was my close relationship with Barry Poss. Here was a man of honesty, integrity in the record business. What a refreshing concept. Sugar Hill recording contracts were a total of 2 pages with no options or restrictive clauses. They could only offer a small budget, but they paid a fair royalty return. When Sugar Hill wanted to do a second album, I asked Al Perkins to produce it. And then he goes on and tells about that second album. So he did 2 albums for Sugar Hill. And this is the first one, Morning Sky. I like that back cover with the dog and the mandolin. So lots of an example of how a small label, an indie label, while it's not going to sell millions of copies, could boost a artist's career by being on a label such as that. Now, there have been some reissues of Sugar Hill records. For instance, I had lost this Marty Stewart record to a basement mold and mildew problem, and I was finally able to pick this up recently uh, as a Vinyl Me Please release. And so some things have been reissued, but not a lot. And I would love to see more reissues. Tony Rice's Church Street Blues was on Sugar Hill. Most of his records were on Rounder, but he did, and a couple on Rebel. But he did those. He did that album, and that is being reissued by Kraft. So that's an important album to look out for that came out originally on Sugar Hill Records in 1998, 20 years after the label started. Poss sold the record label to the Welch Music Group, and was in 2015 it was merged with Rounder Records, another one of the great roots record labels, and eventually it uh, came into ownership with Concord, who owns tons and tons of these indie roots labels and jazz labels and so on and so forth. So, but Poss went on, he became the president of the Welsh Group in 98 and served there, and chairman of the board after a number of years there. And so there is still a Sugar Hill label. It's a imprint, I guess you'd say, on Concord's uh, line of records. And so there are artists that record under Sugar Hill, just as there are artists that record under Rounder, but it's not the same. It's not the same as that 1978 to 1998 period when so many great artists were on Sugar Hill Records, whether they were uh, artists that had been around a long time or up and comers. But there's so much now. I looked at a list here of all the Sugar Hill records I've got in my collection on vinyl. Now I've got a bunch on CD because, of course, by 88 or so, 90, most things were coming out on CD and a lot of them weren't available on vinyl. Uh, Guy Clark, Towns Van Zandt, things like that. A lot of those are only available on CD. But just here's the vinyl that I've got so far. I got two Bluegrass Cardinals records, a Boone Creek record, Byron Berline and Jack Hickman record, two Berline, Crary, and Hickman records, two Carl Jackson records, two Chris Hillman records, two Country Gentleman records, three Dan Crary records, David Grisman record, three Doc Watson records on Sugar Hill, Doyle Lawson and Quicksilver, four from them, Herb Peterson, the Hillman, as you saw here, Hot Rise, and Jimmy Murphy, two John Starlings, Jonathan Edwards with the Seldom Scene, and a Mike Aldridge, who was a member of the Seldom Scene, with the Seldom Scene, but it was kind of a solo album by him. Three Mike Cross, a Newgrass Revival, a Pete Rowan, two Ricky Skaggs and Tony Rice, the classic uh, duo album. Sarah Jarvis, she's on the contemporary Sugar Hill label, the modern era version. Four Seldom Seen, of various artists, and of course I've got the Church Street Blues by Tony Rice. So there's a look, just a quick look at Sugar Hill Records. If you're out there crate digging and you see the label Sugar Hill and you weren't previously familiar with it, I can promise you that the quality of the music will be extremely high and it'll give you many hours of enjoyment if you pick up any of these artists on Sugar Hill. So that'll about do it for me. Everybody, I appreciate you bothering to pay any attention whatsoever to this little look at the indie label Sugar Hill. And I just want to remind everybody, just why not be kind to others, people. Be kind to your neighbors, folks, because we are all neighbors.